ever asked yourself the question, what is standing in my way? Thanks so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. I'm so glad you're here. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and joining me today is my friend Sarah Cochran. She is a pastor and director of advocacy at Destiny Rescue. Sarah honestly takes us along the journey that she has walked along with God.
I felt many years, I think, of our relationship feeling like, wow, and I've even said this to him, you should have married someone else. If I would have known this, I would have never done this to you. Mm-hmm. You know, you say things like that are super raw. I just love him so much. When you love your spouse so much, you want everything in the world for them. And if you feel like you're the roadblock to that, man, that's really hard.
Here's my conversation with Sarah Cochran. Well, I'm so excited to introduce you to the Director of Advocacy for Destiny Rescue and Pastor Sarah Cochran. Sarah, welcome to the Parable Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Danielle. It's great to be here.
I was just thinking back. We met a couple years ago at a boot camp, and I still think like some of these ladies I'm still connected with. So it's so fun to kind of just watch your journey and see where God's taken you. And so also I secretly just love to have podcasts so I can learn more about people. So thanks so much for joining me. You and your husband, Tom, I think if I looked at it correctly, you guys have been married for over 20 years. Is that true?
Yes, 21 as of this year. So okay. Very excited.
You guys live in Florida. How did you guys meet? Was it love at first sight, or was it like, we'll see?
Actually, our story is really funny. Some people think that we have an arranged marriage because our families knew each other when we were kids before we were even born. And my dad introduced his parents together. They didn't know each other. And then a couple months later, they were married. So our stories go way back, but we didn't really grow up together because our families moved to different areas of the U.S. So because of that, we remember each other attending a church together when he was about 13 and I was a couple years younger. And I thought he was complete, dork. He had the big glasses and just kind of arrogant, like trying to find his own as a teenage guy. And so I think he had a crush on me. That's kind of how he tells the story. I didn't realize it at the time, but he was just kind of struggling with, why am I drawn to her? I don't really understand this. So that was only about 6 months, and then we moved away again. And so then my aunt actually lived in the same town as him, and we were able to reconnect after I graduated high school. And I was going to go off to missions and college and all these things. And my aunt's like, you need to get together. And I said, I don't know. I want to keep my options open. And she's like, no, he lives in the same town and you guys will, just really connect. You can never have too many friends. That's what she told me. And she had tried to plant a seed in his ear too. And he's like, God's doing some stuff in my life. I just need to keep my options open. I just want friends right now. She said, well, you can never have too many friends. You should be a great friend. Long story short, we get together one night. He's like, okay, you can go to youth group with me. He was leading youth group at the time. So I went to youth group. I heard him pray, just leading the service. And I was like, my heart melted. And oh man, God, what are you doing here? I'm 18. I just graduated high school. And that was not my plan. I had not planned even to marry a pastor. My dad was a pastor. I was like, this is not how this is going. And I didn't get back to my aunt's house until really late that night. We just sat out by one of his friend's ponds, just talking about our mission trips, talking about all the stuff that God was doing in our hearts, and really have never looked back. I knew within 3 days I was going to marry him, and we didn't get married for another 3 years.
It's so beautiful to hear that story of how you had a heart for mission, heart for the people of God. But you guys get to travel around the country and pastor at different churches. Tell me what has been one of the highlights about that so far for the both of you.
We've always loved doing ministry together because that's how we initially connected. And so oftentimes throughout our ministry, you see one, you see the other. That's kind of how we've been. With Destiny Rescue, it's been really awesome to be able to travel together, see a lot of places, see the work around the world of rescuing kids from trafficking, looking into kids' eyes side by side as a couple, knowing the impact that Destiny Rescue, others have been able to make in their lives is just really huge. We have traveled so many different places, and we just absolutely love it. I think specifically with Destiny Rescue, they've allowed us to kind of spread our wings a little more maybe. And I sometimes am going in opposite direction as he is, because my call to speak has really risen to the surface during this season of our lives. So that's been awesome as well. Like, we love being together and doing things together, but then being apart and then coming back together, and we'll be on a date and all we're talking about is, and then they said this, and then they did this, and then this. And it's just very exciting to still participate together, but also be doing, our own ministry.
When you think back, as exciting as it is, reality is there too. What would you say has been maybe the setbacks of, traveling around, being a pastor, and either trying to find that community or being away from church, things like that?
For most of our marriage, we're in the local church. So he was pastoring, and then my call to pastor also came along with that after we started our church. And so God has done a lot in my story, but the difficulty has really been community. So in being used to being in a local church, then trying to find that community at home when we're gone so much has been difficult. This past year and a half has really brought forth a lot of fruit in that area. We committed to lead a small group at our local church during the week, and then we travel on the weekends. Yeah. And so that was a lot. I mean, we have dogs in the house and we have all of this stuff that's crazy, but we just felt like God wanted us to invest in our local community, our local church, and just in our neighborhood even. So doing that has really produced a lot of fruit and helped us. But for several years, it was difficult to have this sort of close community and friendship. Somebody you can call and say, I'm having a bad day and I really need help. Like, can we meet for coffee or something? Yeah. So that's been the struggle, but I'm really grateful for our local church here.
Sarah, I think like adult friendships are really challenging, not because people don't want them, but because you really have to invest in it. You think back like on the playground as a kid, you're just like, hey, you want to be my friend? Right. It's like, that's it. We have no other cares in the world. And so, as we get older, like we have commitments, we have dogs, right? You have, your husband or your job, whatever. What is like some encouragement when somebody's like, I want to have friends, but I'm like, I want to figure out a way to build that more into my life?
That's a great question. What I have experienced and learned is it's okay to ask somebody. Finding that person, it's weird kind of just finding a person that you like and being like, can we hang out? Can we be friends? But I have asked people in the last year and a half, can we be friends? And also committing to the time to do that, being willing to text them on a regular basis or send them weird gifts on Instagram or like videos or whatever, just connecting with them in a way that's personal, that helps them know who you are, your humor, your struggles. And I think as we are willing to be vulnerable with others and connect with their heart in that way, and they see who we really are, then they're willing to open up. And then that's like the blossoming of friendship, right? When you're willing to be vulnerable and say, I don't have it all together, but I really want to have fun with you as a friend. I want to be there in the good times and the bad. And then showing up, sitting with your friend when their parent is passing away and taking the time off and saying, I'm shoving these meetings and all of the stuff that I have aside because I'm committed to you as a friend. And so just sitting there and being with them in those times, I think that's what true friendship is. And then that they're going to reciprocate when you need them.
You said you grew up as a pastor's kid. When did you know that God called you into pastoring?
Yeah, I felt the call. I didn't grow up in a tradition that encouraged girls to use their voice in that way. And so that was hard for me because I always used to sneak into my dad's library and I would pull books off the bookshelf of missionaries and of ladies, any stories that I could find of ladies who had given their life to God and ministry and people in very special ways. And I would read these and just be so inspired. And then I would sneak them back on the shelf shelf. And at 16, I went on a mission trip and felt God say, I have called you. And I didn't know what that meant. I didn't really have context for what that meant in that time frame, but felt drawn to missions, just being and seeing all of the people that I had never experienced in that level of poverty or that level of just not even knowing who God was. So my heart was warmed towards people in that moment at 16. And then God just began to grow that over time. After my husband and I got married, I was like, okay, I guess I'm marrying a pastor and not a mechanic. I just really leaned in and enjoyed helping him in ministry. But then after we started our church, I started our children's ministry. I started out our first Sunday that we had kids. It was like an infant, a toddler, and a teenager. And I had them in a room, and I'm like, how do I teach this? What's going to happen today? And so God just began to develop within me this desire to see people grow spiritually, regardless of where they are age-wise or on their spiritual journey. I myself gave my heart to Christ when I was 6 at a school. I went to a Christian school, and my teacher led me to faith. And I just was always under the impression that it doesn't matter how old you are, you can start a relationship with God and you can grow from there. And so, and if you're 50 and you don't have a relationship with God, that's okay. You can start that, and then we can grow from there on our spiritual journey. When we started our church, a couple years in, I had started different ministries. I started doing stuff with the women, I started doing stuff with all of our small group leaders across the board, and just became like a spiritual formation pastor sort of idea, and had different titles throughout all of that. But at a certain point, I was at a conference, and there were 2 ladies on stage, and they were speaking. And God just asked me, what is standing in your way? Yeah. You grew up in this framework. You have this framework that says you can't do these things, and that's your understanding and where you're coming from. And yet I've called you, and yet I've walked with you, and yet I've used you, and yet I've poured into you, and yet all of these things. And why do you have a problem? Why do you flinch every time somebody calls you pastor? Why do you hunker down and try to hide when people are saying, this or that about ministry? And I just felt so convicted in that moment. I actually went back to, there was in the atrium, there was a place that you could sign up to get a degree in biblical studies. And I said, okay, God, if I'm in, then I'm all in. I'm going to be educated about what I'm teaching people if you're wanting me to use my voice in a new way. In ministry. And so that was just the call, and thankful for those ladies who went before me and showed me that it was okay. And so went on to get a degree in biblical studies. And then I went on to seminary from there a couple years later. And God has just continuing coming to WSC, to the boot camp. I was still struggling. Even at that point, I had worked through so many things throughout seminary and all the years of ministry, but still struggling in the way that God was opening doors, honestly, through Destiny Rescue to go and speak. And I'd find ways, I shouldn't say this, but I would find ways to be like, I don't know, I can send this person to go. Yeah. You would want this person to go, right? And at a certain point, God said, you need to deal with this. Like, I've called you to do this. And this is a fear inside of you. There's something inside of you. And so just accepting that over the last really 20 plus years of my life has been a journey. But I'm so thankful for people like you, people like others, like the ladies on stage that inspired me, helped show me the way.
Gosh, I appreciate what you just said is like, what is standing in your way? I think so many of us, there's a dream, there's something ahead of us that either we feel called to or even a little hesitant still. And you're just kind of wondering like, I don't know if I can do that, because you said the word framework too. I mean, as you grew up, like there is like even invisible boundaries or emotional things that we're working through. Like, can I do this? Am I not good enough? I totally resonate with that. So yeah, that's a great question for anyone who is kind of processing through like, what is standing in your way? Sarah, I'd love to know how this possibly kind of plays into your story, because I think everything's kind of all like tangled together. And that's the beauty of parable stories, is that we get to see God's goodness woven through all of that. So Sarah, what is your parable story you'd like to share with us today?
So along with my journey and call to ministry, has also been this very personal story of infertility and not being able to have kids. And that has really marked me. We wanted to have kids right away when we got married, early 20s, and just really excited about life and family. We both come from decently large families, so it's just an expectation of all these kids are going to be wonderful and this excitement. And suddenly it didn't happen. And it didn't happen again. And it didn't happen again. And then fertility treatments after year, and it just wasn't happening. And I kept asking God, like, what's going on? What am I not doing? Honestly, with my name being Sarah, I've always compared myself to Sarah in Scripture, Abraham and Sarah. I'm like, oh, I was cursed with my name, you know, and I don't use that word lightly, really, but I just really had this deep sense of, God, come on, really? Like, we're going to play this out in real life. In modern day time, I'm going to be Sarah. Thankfully, I didn't marry Abraham. His name is Tom. But just I have always felt that way, I think, since the struggle began. And so there is this relationship with God when he's calling you to do something in ministry. And yet you're struggling personally going, but won't you answer the prayer and desire of my own heart? There's a tension there, right? There's a struggle. And at a certain point in my journey, God just asked me the question, Sarah, you know, I'm praying, I'm crying. Sarah, will you just take care of my kids? Like, I have kids and I'm calling you to take care of my kids. And you have time on your hands because I haven't given you children of your own. So that's been a whole personal journey of what does that look like personally and even professionally and as a career and as my life. How do I take care of God's kids? What does that look like? And it's taken me on a journey of foster care and adoption. And a lot of that was really rough. And I didn't necessarily enjoy most of it. And so God's like, oh yeah, be careful what you pray for, Sarah. So it's been a great journey. And recently, just this year in God, sort of redeeming my story, of course, working for an organization that rescues kids worldwide from trafficking. Also, just everything that I get to do in ministry that I've done in starting a children's ministry at the church we went to and pouring into families and pouring into moms. But this year I've been studying the story of Mary and Elizabeth and what God was birthing inside of them. And it was as if God said in a moment when I was praying one day and studying this passage, actually for a sermon, he said, I don't want you to compare yourself to Sarah anymore. I want you to compare yourself to Elizabeth, because it says that Elizabeth was blameless. She and her husband were, he was a priest in the temple, and it says they were blameless, and yet she was barren. And what did that look like as God started birthing something inside of her? And he used it metaphorically, right, to say, what is a dream that God is birthing inside of me that then can be launched into serving his kids in a really powerful way. So I would say just even in my own story as a kid, things that I faced and struggled with, really always connecting and getting kids very uniquely because of my own struggles. And so even just to have a conversation, I'll be in a store and my husband's like, kids are so drawn to you. I don't understand, there'll be a little kid in the shopping cart or buggy or whatever you call it. And they'll just be staring at me. And I'm like, they see the kid in me. Like they look into my eyes and they see she gets it. And so it's just God has totally taken my personal journey and then created something beautiful out of it. And I love it so much. I'm grateful.
That's been a process for you. You said you guys got married really young. You've been married for 20 years. So you've been walking this journey for a while. And it's a process because I don't know how you grew up, but I just imagine, okay, I'm going to get married one day and I'm going to have have like 2.5 kids. This is going to be my life. And so when we have these dreams, when we have this, what we feel is a call on our life, what we feel like everyone should have, it's really heart-wrenching. And so when you said the sentence of like, God asked you this question, which I'm curious, Sarah, like it feels like God like always presents you with these questions, which I love. Sarah, will you just take care of my kids? Were you like, no thanks?
My initial response was, God is so kind, because he will come to where we are and even use the language that we are using in order to draw us to himself. Yeah. And so he took that concept of kids, and we're all God's children, right? And he's trying to get me to come up to where he's seeing this perspective of me of going, I have done so much in your life, and you have so much to give, and you have so much potential, and I want to do so many things with you and through you, and yet you're stuck over here on the word kids. And so in him, I just felt like in that moment, my first response was, God, you're so kind. And then second of all, it was like, can't I do both? Like, can I have both? And then it was that just sort of release of maybe God had something for me bigger than I realized. Yeah, absolutely. And that created excitement. You're right, though. It's a journey. It takes a long time to get there. There are some years that I'm not super proud of in my story. I'm not super proud of the fact that I couldn't show up to baby showers for years of my life and celebrate with others because all I would do is cry. Yeah. And I didn't want to ruin their day. And yet I wanted to love my friends and my family members and all of this. Yeah, there are some things that we struggle with, or even having a conversation, being a part of conversations where we're talking about labor and delivery and birth. And I'm like, I'm not in this conversation. So there are some real struggles. And now I'm getting to the age, like some of my a little bit older friends are like, oh yeah, I'm going to have grandkids. And that still is a sting, right? That's like, oh, ouch. Yeah, I don't know if that'll happen for me because of how my story is. And just always going back to that question, though, that God's like, yeah, but actually I might have something really awesome for you if you would just be willing to step into taking care of my kids. So you're right. It's a journey.
It is. You had wrote something on Instagram, because that's what I do is I go back and look at everyone's posts. And you were like, I don't remember writing this, but I'm going to share it with you anyways. It says, while my heart was breaking, God was inwardly awakening, like this deep pain that couldn't be undone. And I do have to ask, like, you and Tom are married. Infertility is real for not only you, but also for him. What has this been like for your relationship with each other? Because to make a baby, it's a two-way street. So there's some hardship and like things that you have to work through. What does that look like? How God has undone and taught you something as a couple?
So early on, I felt many, many years, I think, of our relationship feeling like, wow. And I've even said this to him, you should have married someone else. Gosh. I wish you would have chosen someone else. I wish if I would have known this, I would have never done this to you. You say things like that are super raw because I just love him so much. When you love your spouse so much, you want everything in the world for them. And if you feel like you're the roadblock to that, man, that's really hard. But seeing and experiencing, I'm so blessed in that my husband has been overly gracious. And for him, I just think you would be a wonderful mom. So I want you to be a mom. And that's a desire of your heart. And so I want that for you. And I think probably some of our story and struggles through foster care and adoption was that tension between the two of us going, we want to have a family. We want to pass on a legacy. We want to pass on what God's given us in the form of a family unit. And yet all we seem to be able to do right is have like dogs in our life and to be able to raise them. But our relationship has grown because of the grace that he's given. And I tell him this often. He has lived out Jesus to me in just loving me. He's like, I didn't marry you so that you could give me kids. I married you because I really like you and I've fallen in love with you. And so he has struggled, and there have been days where I think he feels like he can't share his struggle as much with me because he doesn't want to hurt me. So there's that reality too. But we did have to have a frank conversation at some point. And I said, if you're holding back those vulnerable feelings that you actually feel, then I feel like you're just cutting me off.
Yeah.
Even if it does hurt me a little bit, I need you for our relationship to deepen and grow, just to be fully open and honest with me. Please keep doing it in a kind way. Please keep being Jesus, but also Jesus gives truth. And I need you to do that for us to, get over some humps, even in our relationship. Because I was feeling like he's not being honest with me here. So what is he not being honest with me in other areas? I really just need to know. So we've had to grow in that. But he's really been so gracious over the years. And, on the days where I'll just be awesomely vulnerable here, locking myself in the bathroom and just crying on the floor, crying. He's like sitting outside the door going, it's going to be okay. Like, I love you. It's going to be okay. And so we're very close because of those times. And I think looking back to what we're able to do now and sometimes be gone from each other for weeks on end, a long time, we're just so close because of those times that we went together and we trust each other completely. So God uses everything. He uses absolutely everything for our good and his glory. So
that's such a great perspective, Sarah, where there's like a relationship in our life. It's like a two-person thing. And so if you have like these feelings, you have to share them with the other person, because that's only going to deepen that relationship. I mean, even going back to our conversation about adult friendships, we have to choose that level of trust to go deeper. Thank you for letting us like peek into behind the scenes of your marriage. I'd be curious, God has called this on your life to like minister to his kids. You work with an organization called Destiny Rescue, and you kind of shared a little bit about that. But tell me, how long have you been working with them, and what has God shown you through this organization?
So I've been with the organization for about 6 years. I volunteered for a year and then came on staff 5 years ago. And God has really taught me so much about healing from trauma, just even for my own life and going back to my childhood, being like, oh yeah, there's some things that I need to forgive. There's some things that I need to handle. But our aftercare process that the kids go through has really been enlightening for me and teaching me about forgiveness in our life and the power of forgiveness. We think sometimes people think of forgiveness when something really terrible happens to you or your feelings are hurt, or no matter how big or small, we feel like it's the weaker thing to do sometimes. Like, saying it out loud, we're like, oh no, that's not true. But in the moment, it's like, I want to stand up for myself. I want to defend myself. And yet that's not what Scripture calls us to. That's not what God wants us to do. And so he's built within us that when we release whatever happened to us, so we have the kids that we serve with Destiny Rescue, they're releasing maybe their traffickers, maybe their friends that introduced them to somebody who wasn't safe, or maybe family members who betrayed them through this process, or even the abusers themselves. Like, what does that look like across the board to forgive? But when this release happens of, oh, I'm actually letting go of everything, to not just to let go and be still, but to let go, release, and then move forward with a plan. And that really has been, I've connected so much with it. I really didn't realize how much I would connect with it until I really started volunteering. I'm like, all right, I get this now. Because my own story has been release the old framework, release this, release that. And just go into whatever is ahead of you. Don't release it and then just sit here like, what do I do now? But moving forward with what is the possibility, because I am so strong to be able to have faced that and then forgiven that and move forward in a really positive way. And so our survivors are my heroes, honestly, the things that they have faced. And then they step into their freedom to then go on to own a business, to have get married, have families, to work in different fields like being police officers or missionaries and traveling and speaking about the gospel. Like, all the things over the last 20 years that the organization has been around since 2001, man, to see where these ladies are now, and we do serve boys as well, but it's mostly 96% are women and children. But it's amazing. They're inspiring to me. So God's taught me a lot.
I think that's just like the powerful part of like stories and getting connected to other people, where you're able to see something in them that connects back to your story. Sarah, if you're willing, like you mentioned, like there was some trauma and stuff that happened in your childhood. What was that process like of like bringing that up to the surface? Have you ever dealt with that? Or was that like, oh, wait, what is this?
I think in probably getting really serious about what God had for me and recognizing that if I was going to communicate his word on a regular basis, I had to just be a clean vessel. And I knew that there were some things under the surface that were still hurting, and I didn't really know or understand much of it. So part of the process was going to counseling and doing that for several years, and still see my counselor on a pretty regular basis. So that's been very helpful. Great Christian counselors. I recommend them all day long. Worth their weight in gold. But that also just being willing, I think the final willingness to go, I'm okay to open those doors, and whatever mess comes out, we're going to deal with, and it's going to be okay. There's hope on the other side. And having the hard conversations with people in your life, maybe that they're still a part of your life and you still have to interact with them. And how is that affecting you now? And what boundaries need to be put in place? And making sure, I think the friendship thing is also connected for me, because making sure that I have a wide variety of friends in different levels and places, so that I have that social structure that is supporting me in any area. And so that if I'm having a bad day, I'm not just dumping it on everyone, but I know who I can connect with that can actually help me in that area of my life. So that's been helpful too. A good social structure. My friends are everything to me, and counseling, being willing to open up.
You've had a really awesome opportunity as you walk through the entirety of your life. God is still using you in like new and different ways. And so you are in the process with a couple other ladies working on a book. It's hopefully going to be launched this December. Watch out. Can you tell us like what was the theme and like what even like started that catalyst to get it going?
And all three of us writers are part of Women's Speaker Collective. And that's how we each got connected through one of the events or online calls or whatever. We were in a brainstorming session, and I threw out the idea, hey, we should, because the question was, how do we empower women and help them with their framework and with their understanding of girls can use their voices and it's okay. And God does call us to do that. And how do we empower them to do that? And I said, we need to start when they're young, because I was thinking about my own story in that moment as we're brainstorming. I was like, we need to start when they're young, because I gave my heart to God when I was 6. And I remember being on the tree swing outside of my yard and just talking to God during that time. And I remember him asking me questions even then, in that young of an age. And so I'm like, if I would have had maybe some certain values poured into me or given to me as resources or tools during that season of my life, man, maybe my life would have gone differently, but maybe it would be similar, but I think I would have felt better inside. Maybe my life would be exactly what it is, but inside of my own heart, not doubting myself, not allowing outside voices to affect what the choices I was making. So, and opportunities that I was jumping at, right? So we need to write a book for kids. Let's write a book for kids. And then I got to thinking, just in my own journey of looking for resources for children, like, you know what? There's not a lot of devotionals for kids who are like ages 4 to 9. And how do we write something that's a devotional that really helps them grab a hold of the idea that they can use their voice, that God loves them, that there is this idea out there that things can look differently than maybe just here in our own little bubble and space. And so that's where the idea started. And 2 of the other ladies jumped on board. And well, one jumped on board, and then I actually reached out to the other one because I was like, she needs to be on my team. So thankfully she said yes. And it is awesome. I can't wait for it to come out in December.
I just am excited, Sarah, because it really kind of shows like the testimony of where God has led you and what he's like done his work in you. And it brings me back, like it makes me think, ooh, I get emotional here. Like you were talking about being in your dad's library and like just being a little girl and just to have that opportunity for girls to see themselves and like to know that they are seen and known.
Yeah.
Gosh, thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing your story. If people wanted to get connected to you in any way, how can they do that?
You can follow me on Instagram or reach out, DM me, Sarah Faith Cochran on Instagram, and also my email address. You can put that in the notes as well.
Yeah.
The Destiny Recipe email. Yep.
Yeah. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your journey with us today.
Thank you.
Well, I really love that God talks to Sarah and he encourages her in these question prompts. If you like Sarah's story, check out her co-writing partners, Nikki Teague. She's available on episode 63 or D Cook at 136. To connect with Sarah or learn more about Destiny Rescue, simply visit DanielleZapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions that may sound a little bit familiar. Number 1, what is standing in your way right now? Is there a boulder that's in your path, or maybe you just haven't had the courage to go forward? Number 2, he asked Sarah, will you just take care of my kids? So my question for you is, who is God asking you to take care of today? One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing this episode with a friend. If you could pass that along today, that really helps people find out about these parable stories. Also, a huge shout out to my husband, Eric, for his talented editing expertise. That's going to do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how God always makes a way. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.